So next I would like to re-invite my colleague Michael Igoe up to the stage, who again is the host of our Climate Plus podcast. He recently did an episode with one of our panelists, Harjeet Singh, where he said, I'm going to quote, "Rich countries drag their feet and climate vulnerable countries pay the price." So in this next session on climate finance, we're going to ask, can leaders make good on past promises? Over to you, Michael.
We're getting towards the end of the day. It's been a really exciting one, and I'm just really excited for this conversation because, if there's sort of one big theme from the COP, I think it's this issue of trust and the integrity of this process, the integrity of this agreement that's been forged. And really, at the end of the day, that's what climate finance is all about. It's about following through on commitments. It's about making sure that those commitments actually translate into impact. And it's hard to think of a more urgent conversation than that at the COP here this year. So I'm delighted to be joined by a panel who's going to come at this from a few different directions. Down at the end is Harjeet Singh, who's the head of global political strategy at Climate Action Network International. Sonali Patel is a partner with the Bridgespan group. Joab Okanda is the Pan-Africa Senior Advocacy Advisor at Christian Aid. And Arsalan Mahtafar is head of the JP Morgan DFI. So you can see we've got a collection of perspectives here, all of them focused on this question of how we can fill what is truly a staggering climate finance gap. I was really struck by something that USAID Administrator Samantha Power pointed out yesterday at one of the events that she participated in, which was that if you took all official development assistance and redirected it to climate action, it would only account for 1/6 of the need. And that's not to mention the fact that all of that development assistance is already being used for extremely important things. So we wouldn't want to do that. It's just a staggering amount of need that's out there. But we also know there are big untapped pools of funding available, potential funding available from private investors and philanthropists. And the question is how to bring them into the fold more effectively, while also keeping a sharp focus on these commitments that have been made, which are largely centered around public finance. So I thought maybe we could start with Harjeet, because Harjeet is someone that I've known for a long time, and I've known him really as a person that I rely on incredibly to tell me what's going on inside of the negotiation halls. And I thought maybe you could just sort of, since we're getting towards the end of the day, our rest day, I hope you've all enjoyed your rest day. Before we gear up for getting back to work tomorrow, where do things stand right now? Broadly speaking, without getting into sort of the wordsmithing of the documents, how are you feeling about the state of climate finance and the state of this sort of question of trust between the global south and the global north over these commitments that have been made?
Sure. Thank you very much, Michael, for having me. Such a pleasure to be with my co-panelists. First of all, let me say that when we talk about climate finance, it's not about business opportunities. It's not about investments. It's about delivering climate justice. Probably 30 years ago, we could have seen it as an investment. But now where we are, when we are living through climate emergency, it is about justice. And this is the issue that has seen least progress over the last 30 years. And the reason we are facing this climate emergency because climate finance has not been delivered. Let me put it that straight. It is at the heart of the issue, yet gets very little progress. And the numbers that you mentioned, you pick up any issue and you will realize that we have actually been dragging our feet, in particularly rich countries who are supposed to be providing that money. Adaptation Finance Report, GAP report, what does it say? The needs are 10 to 18 times more. The current commitment of doubling adaptation finance is going to only meet 5 to 10% of the deficit that we have in terms of adaptation gap. Let's talk of mitigation. How much is the investment flowing? $400 billion a year. What we need is more than $2 trillion. And that's also an underestimation. So where are we in terms of ambition? We are not going there. Loss and damage. We finally got traction on day one, historic, unprecedented money, $700 million. We welcomed. Now we are beginning to find out that a lot of money is also going to funding arrangements and a lot of insurance is being put into the package. So if you don't provide money, so why we come to UNFCCC? And again, your point on trust, Michael. We are coming here because a bunch of countries and corporations are responsible for the climate crisis. We are here for climate justice. We are not here for an expo. If we need to only have conversations and share learning, we can do it anywhere. We don't have to come to COP. COP is about justice. COP is about some are responsible, they are obligated to pay, they are supposed to pay, period. Now these hoops and loops of conversations that are happening are distracting us from the core issue of climate finance. We are talking about developing countries. The reason they are developing means they don't have resources and they're making choices every day. You know, we can keep talking about, you know, those technical advancements and, you know, tinkering here and there and we'll make it investment friendly. That's not helping. We need to take the money to several times, only then things are going to change. And that has not been happening. So when developing countries have to make a choice, they have to make a choice between feeding people, building a school, or putting a solar panel. So where are we in terms of issue? Trust. Rich countries have not allowed us to have a definition on climate finance. Why? So that they can count anything and everything. That 70% of money that has been provided in the name of $100 billion is loans. It is going to exacerbate the debt crisis, and the previous panel was talking about it. You talk about mitigation, it has become a workshop and keep talking, and that's exactly what happened June this year when agenda was not even agreed until the last day. Why? Because we are expecting developing countries to deliver on mitigation without providing any money. And now the money that has been pledged in the name of loss and damage finance, we know that adaptation is struggling. So they are going to take money from the mitigation pot or adaptation pot and give it for loss and damage because there is huge political pressure now. What does it mean? You are actually intensifying climate emergency because you are not working on mitigation adaptation enough. So there is a massive trust issue.
I think the day of rest may be over, Harjeet. Okay, there may be some disagreement on the panel here, and I would welcome that. You're rightly keeping us focused on these commitments that have been made. At the same time, it is the case that there's a big emphasis here on crowding in additional funding in recognition of the fact that those commitments aren't coming through. One potential source is philanthropy. Sonali, I wonder if you could just talk to us about where you see the opportunity to build a better on-ramp to crowd more philanthropic dollars into climate action, recognizing the fact that we still have to keep an emphasis on the bigger picture and the trust issue and the past commitments that have been made on the public side as well.
Philanthropy probably can't fill the gap that public dollars can fill, but philanthropy can play a really critical role. And I think increasingly you're seeing more and more people come on board to climate philanthropy being part of what their portfolio is. And I think that's really important. And you're also increasingly seeing philanthropists who are in the global north recognizing that philanthropy has to happen in the global south to actually combat this crisis. And so I think that also is really critical at this moment. The tricky part is there are a lot of commitments that have been made and not a lot of money is flowing because it's really difficult to figure out what the on-ramps are to actually start to give, and particularly given the global south, which is what you were talking about. And some of the things that we've seen and what we're trying to encourage philanthropists to do is one, just to start by experimenting, and you can experiment in a few ways. One is to work in collaboration. So there are a lot of funds out there that actually have expertise and know proximate organizations on the ground and can help commit dollars to those organizations, even if you as a philanthropist don't have a huge staff that can go out and do the diligence and the research yourself. So I know Laura from Global Green Grants was here earlier. That's a great example of one that works at the intersection of gender equity and climate equity. But there are many others, and so we encourage people to do that. There are also big global funds that are giving money. So go give to ClimateWorks or go engage CLI and learn from them on how you can give money effectively and efficiently in the global south as well as elsewhere. The other place where I think it's really important that philanthropy has a role to play is now in implementation, because oftentimes when there's a gap in implementation funding, philanthropy can fill that initial gap, especially if they crowdsource funding in. And I think we saw that with the Kigali Amendment years ago. After it was passed, it was actually philanthropy that came in and said, we're going to help support this in developing countries, and then the public funding followed that. And so there's a role for philanthropy to play to catalyze public funding to come in to actually support the policy's implementation once those policies are achieved, which I think is really, really important. And then the final role is oftentimes like just basic research is needed or small grants are needed just to prove that models work. And philanthropy can do that. You know, a small grant of a couple $100,000, $1 million going into the global south, proving that these innovations work that are happening in the global south can help crowdsource in other funding. And so I think that's a role that philanthropy can play in supporting the type of development that you're talking about.
That's great. Yeah, I want to build on something that you said there, Sonali, and come to you, Arsalan. The implementation piece and the filling these gaps to figure out what actually works in financing these kinds of projects or funding these kinds of projects. You know, we hear a lot about the quantity of funding that's needed, the quantity of need and the gaps. At this COP, I've been struck by hearing quite a bit about the quality piece of this as well. So Arsalan, I know you've done a lot of work on sort of building out tools for those who might invest in climate projects to actually have the ability to see that those investments are achieving the impacts that they got into it in the first place to achieve. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like and where you see some of the opportunity to kind of build that integrity into the process? So it's not just people, investors throwing money at something and saying, hey, congratulations to me, and then walking away, but actually making sure that amounts to something real.
Sure. To the point that there's a lot of capital needed for sustainable development and for climate justice that you mentioned, private sector obviously has to be a big part of the solution, and there was conversation in the previous panel about the financial architecture as well. Now, the amount of capital that currently the private sector holds that is under some measurement of ESG is over $40 trillion. But if you think about what are the measures of ESG they're using, and they have good intentions, they're like, I'm going to put money into green companies. But then who are the greenest companies? These could be insurance companies, these could be tech companies, just because their operations don't actually have a carbon footprint. Now, if you move down the scale towards being more intentional around actually making a difference, then you get into sustainability strategies, then you get into impact investing. And there, it is about making a difference. And sometimes that difference does require you to invest in a maybe brown firm, but with one that has pledges to reduce their carbon emissions, reduce their carbon intensity, and provides transparency on actually how much they're making that movement. So what we do with our clients is to bring much more measurability and specificity around their intentions for incremental impact towards the development gaps, including obviously climate action, but also all the SDGs. And in the previous panel with the development banks, these two are very interconnected. And then have a commitment to ongoing monitoring and reporting against that progress. And that brings not just more capital from the sustainable investors, but to your point, a different quality of capital. Type of investors that actually want to engage on these topics, want to make that difference, are more towards the impact and sustainability scale of that spectrum, and now have the fact base they have to engage with these with the management of these companies on these type of conversations and ensure that they make good on the promises that they make.
Yeah, absolutely. Joab, I'm curious how you sort of bridge the gap here. We've got, on the one hand, a clear call for public finance that is built around responsibility justice, as Harjeet said. But then also, it does seem an opportunity to use some of that to leverage additional funding and to bring in investors, philanthropists. Do you see a way to do that without sort of diluting the original intention of those pledges that were made? How do you think about sort of the innovative piece of this? Does that work with the original sort of climate justice framing of these pledges?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think the myth that we need to bust, first of all, is that there's not enough public money to deal with the climate crisis. We need to bust that myth. When you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, by 2021, the world had mobilized about $33.3 trillion in global stimulus. Most of that was public money. When we look at the financial flows from the global south to the global north, it's massive. Africa alone loses about $88 billion annually. If we reverse those flows, we'll have enough money to deal with the climate crisis. And what we are saying with the increased call for private sector involvement is basically developed countries running away from their responsibility and socializing risks, because they are calling on governments to de-risk the private sector, socializing risks and then privatizing profits. Private sector making massive profits from climate investments at the expense of countries, at the expenses of people. Then we're privatizing services and passing on that cost to actually the people. We're seeing countries actually borrow to de-risk the private sector. And that is problematic. Look at the debt situation that we have to deal with now, and how even the climate impacts are causing countries to go into more debt. Colombia just recently signed the Fossil Fuels Non-Proliferation Treaty. And immediately we are seeing credit rating agencies downgrading Colombia. That's problematic. We saw Kenya, for example, when the president was talking about reforming the global financial architecture. Immediately, Kenya's credit rating agency, credit rate went down. So this is a problem that we need to fix. We need to deal with the global financial architecture that has been structured in a way to benefit the wealthy. People here at this COP, there are discussions about how to make super yachts sustainable. If that is what is dominating conversations at COP, then why are we here talking about there not being enough finance? Countries like Mozambique, for example, building bridges, they're being washed away by floods. Malawi trying to get its population to get access to electricity by investing in green technology, building hydro dams so that it can supply power to its population. At first, there's a drought, so the plant can't work. And immediately after the drought, there is flooding that then washes away this hydropower plant. It used a loan to build that plant from the World Bank, and the World Bank was ready to give another loan so that it can rebuild. So those are the issues that we are facing. The developing countries are already paying the price, and we just need justice and rich countries to honor their pledges. From the 1970s, when they committed, for example, to provide 0.7% of their GDP towards overseas development assistance, we've not seen that happen. It's more than 50 years later. They're only spending 0.3%, yet they're spending 2% of their GDP on military. That's not acceptable. We just need to prioritize. We just need maybe a change in politicians. I don't know whether we have that in the global south. Politicians who value other races, because it seems the black race, people of color, are not valued anymore. And that's why we're having to take a whole day to negotiate about whether a comma should be there or not. Thanks.
Thanks, Joab. In a minute, I'm going to ask someone from the audience to weigh in here. But Harjeet, let me just ask you to sort of circle back and reflect on a few of the things that have come up here. I mean, is there a way to, can you imagine a way to take all of these different approaches to climate finance and still build them under the umbrella of climate justice? I mean, is it not sort of beneficial to have lots of people wanting to fund climate projects? How do you sort of square the circle there?
No, so Michael, when we say public finance is needed, we don't mean that private sector doesn't have a role to play. And it's not an antagonistic relationship. I think we need to get the sequencing right. I'm glad Mizan is sitting here from Bangladesh. Let me give a non-climate example. Bangladesh now has massive garment industry. Do you think it just happened because private sector suddenly one day decided? Government played that role to create that infrastructure and training people and striking deals with governments to make sure. I come from India. Pharmaceutical industry, IT industry, do you think they have grown just like that? Sequencing is first you make public investment. You create those kind of policies and basic infrastructure and human resource, and then private sector thrives on that. Here, if you don't have public finance of hundreds of billions, how can you attract trillions? So you are talking about trillions, but we have not seen those trillions being made work for climate action. And the other thing is, as I said, we have reached a point where we are living through the climate crisis. We have to start looking at climate action as public good. And even private sector has to look at how much profit they can actually make. When we say, let's make technology freely available, let's reward the innovators. We are not saying let's not do that. You can use money from the Green Climate Fund and reward innovators. But we are living through the crisis now. All countries should be manufacturing solar panels and putting up wind farms. We need to be seeing that revolution. But that is not happening. And of course, their private sector will have a role to play. But our leaders are not recognizing that there is this sequence involved. They have to put money on the table, and that's how things are going to work, and that will catalyze those trillions of dollars that are needed. So it's not antagonistic, but it's thinking that only private sector will do, and there are countries like the US particularly saying everything for private sector. And let me give you data. Adaptation. Private sector's contribution is only 2% because they don't see any opportunity to make money. Even on mitigation, the recent OECD report says that they have not been able to mobilize private finance for even mitigation. Forget about loss and damage. So governments have to play that role. Public money has to be put on the table. Only then rest of the financing streams are going to work.
Right. Does anyone else want to jump in? Yeah. Arsalan, why don't you go first?
Yeah. I just wanted to build on the point around sequencing. So one of the constraints we see for especially climate change mitigation is the availability of bankable projects. So from the position of an investment bank, we cannot raise capital for a project that hasn't yet developed the feasibility studies, the environmental and social impact studies, the offtake agreements, all of the the studies and paperwork that is needed in order for it to be bankable. And there, the public sector can support and come in as a sequence first to help make those bankable projects. Then the private sector could come and finance them. So I think that sequencing there could really help mobilize the private sector. I don't think all of the private sector, what it needs from the public sector is necessarily concessional capital and blended finance. And that's another point I wanted to just make, is that a lot of sustainable development can happen commercially. There is risk-adjusted returns in developing countries that also have development impact, and yet there's still not enough capital flowing to those opportunities. And that's part of the raison d'etre of my team at JP Morgan, DFI, to originate and structure more of those opportunities for the investors that want to deploy sustainable capital but just don't see enough investment opportunities.
Great. Joab, let me press pause just to invite in a question, but then you can respond to that or respond to the question as you see fit. But I want to just really quickly kick it over to Tauran Zaman Raya, just to focus us a little bit on another aspect of this challenge.
Yeah, it's a very invigorating discussion. So I'm from Bangladesh, and we are known globally for our efforts to actually successfully battle climate change, being one of the most vulnerable countries. But even then, even despite all our efforts, in 2022 alone, we had 7.1 million people being displaced due to climate change. And it's been estimated that this number can increase to up to 13.5 million by 2050. So, even if the finance is coming, the loss and damage and the impacts of climate change will multiply at a much higher rate. So it's the need for the climate changes, the need for climate finance will only increase, and so the leaders don't only need to make good on their past promises, but they'll have to make more promises, and they'll have to deliver a much higher rates of climate finance. On that note, Bangladesh, we have I work with ECAT, and we work with the local actors a lot, and we have a lot of examples and case studies of successful locally led solutions which have helped local communities to actually adapt to climate change and become resilient. And we have had examples of farmers losing their farms, losing their productivity, but then because of their local knowledge and traditional knowledge, they've been able to actually diversify their livelihoods and actually recover from the damages. And that's been helped by the local government, domestic resources, and also the local NGOs like BRAC. But the problem is that they're not able to upscale it to different regions. It's just, remote regions are working towards remote solutions. And that's where the gap comes in, because they don't have the resources. Even the national government does not have the resources to actually upscale these solutions. So but then you have the Green Climate Fund, which actually is known for its, Green Climate Fund, Bangladesh is one of the highest recipients of the Green Climate Fund money. But then we have organizations complaining about the GCF, how stringent its rules are, because GCF wants to ensure that the money actually goes to the people who need it the most. But when on that hand, what happens is that because of these rules, the efficiency and the speed of the money is slowed. So it's a very double-edged sword. On one end, you want to ensure that the local people get the money, but if you set in the rules and different stringent measures, then the efficiency becomes slower. So it's very important that the leaders not only increase their the delivery of climate finance, but it's also important that they ensure that the local communities get it efficiently without any delays. So yeah, I want to know what the others have to say about this. Thank you.
Yeah, so sort of the clear manifestation of the gap, but then also how do communities actually access this funding. Joab, I don't know if you want to jump in there and respond to this question about local access, or if you want to go back to the point that you were going to make earlier. We're close to out of time, so.
Yeah, no, thanks. Response. Just to quickly, on the point earlier, this year we celebrated 70 years of Germany's debt cancellation. And when you look at Germany, they didn't only cancel debt because that would not have taken them away from the hole they were in. There was massive grants-based investments in Germany, and that's what has led it to be the industrial power that it is today. And so when you are in a hole, you just don't need water and bread for you to survive for another week. You actually need a ladder to come out. And for Africa in particular and developing countries, all we need, the finance we need, is a finance that delivers the economic transformation that we need on the continent. A transformation that will enable the global south, for example, my country, Kenya, to produce the grains instead of moving grains from Russia to the port of Mombasa, emitting all the carbon while moving that. So that is the kind of finance we are looking for, and we don't think that the private sector will deliver that kind of finance that is required for economic transformation. On your question about community access, this is very, very important, and structures have to be put in place. There are countries where these structures are already existing. For example, my country, Kenya, we have what we call locally led climate finance that is devolved to the community level. The communities where you have we have a devolved system of government, and the different counties, they're called county governments, have passed a law that requires them to actually allocate 4% of their budget towards climate action. And the communities get to decide how that money is invested and in which projects that money is actually invested. And I'm happy to say that actually Christian Aid piloted that model, and it has now been taken up by the national government.
Great, thanks. I'm afraid we have to leave it there. We could go on much, much longer. But please join me in thanking the panelists, and please try to connect with them afterwards. I know there's a lot more to talk about. Thank you all. Thank you.